Thank you, Alex. Yesterday, I heard at various times, among the very important things that were mentioned, some reference to the topic I want to share with you today on education and what I would call the learning crisis. So I heard people say that education, public education, is failing us in terms of pushing back on fake news, that there's a need to improve the schooling system so that people can differentiate truth from non-truths, that we need to institute. Thank you. We need to institute a new curriculum and the like. And what I want to share in my PowerPoint is that there's a fundamental challenge that faces us in terms of the ability to produce the sort of students, graduates that are needed to address some of these challenges and many others. So in the PowerPoint that you'll see.
Could you get the PowerPoint up, please?
We have we will launch next week a call, the World Bank will, that is, on the learning crisis. And one of the facts that will come out, it's already been published, is that 51% of school children below the age of 10 are unable to read a single sentence. So tremendous crisis going on. The other starting point I have, this is something I found over a year ago about a Japanese company that had laid off 30 adjusters. These are university-educated, white-collar workers, replaced them with AI. And it was so expensive, yet the efficiency savings allowed them to reap the cost of the investment within a year, and they are going to support those workers for the rest of what would have been their working lives with full salary. So the threat to work and learning is there. At the same time, we celebrate what I would call this revolution in education. We're more educated now than we've ever been, if we measure it by the common measure of years of schooling or enrollment rates or proportion of the population with some level of schooling. And we will have convergence. There's only so many years of schooling people can have in the formal education system, so we are going to see convergence on this indicator. And this is a very good investment. Many other benefits to education. One of them is the labor market returns, the salary that you earn. So it makes sense to go to school from a private perspective, family, social, and the like. And what level of education is most profitable from a wage salary perspective? It's tertiary education. We're seeing tremendous growth, social demand for higher education throughout the world. High-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries throughout the world. Much higher returns, significantly higher returns for women and girls at all levels of schooling in pretty much every country in the world. So it gives added impetus to calls for girls' education. But we are seeing in the labor market some important challenges. The access, despite the tremendous success, there are still children out of school. The quality issue that I want to focus on, because this is the fundamental challenge that we'll have in terms of using the education system to address many things that people are talking about today. And the skill shift, a real change in the kinds of competencies, abilities that labor market and employers are demanding of workers in the future. So despite our success, especially on access, 260 million children, according to UNESCO, are still out of school. These are school-age children out of school. And among those in school, 260 million are attending, but even after 2, 3, sometimes 4 years of schooling, cannot read in the language of instruction. Right? And again, according to UNESCO, 1 in 4 young people in developing countries unable to read. So this is the fundamental challenge, because education, I read yesterday that the New Brunswick, Canada Minister of Education is calling for an end to age grade education and grouping children in different ways. But until that time comes, this is a sector that's very sequential. If you want university, you go to primary school, you go to secondary school. So we need those basic fundamental skills before we get the other higher order types of skills. So no matter how you view schooling or how you think higher levels of schooling should be organized, the fundamentals, the ability to read, do math, is a skill we need to build on, and that is not being produced by many of the education systems around the world. We've documented using the standardized assessments, including PISA, that Malta and many other countries, 75 to 80 countries use, TIMSS, PEARLS, regional assessments in Africa and Latin America, and an early reading test. And we try to harmonize those scores so they can be comparable. And what we find is a tremendous gap between the higher income, high performing countries and the developing countries. The differences are about between the highest performers, lower performers, more than 2 standard deviations. In simpler terms, it's a whole generation schooling loss in developing countries. So if you look at how many years of schooling countries in low-income countries are investing in, when you compare the learning outcomes of the highest performers, it almost erases the whole schooling investment in low-income countries. And the more we measure learning in the world, more countries that participate in these assessments, we find the gap is even bigger. It's not that it's growing, just now we're measuring it better and including more countries. So the gaps are huge. And the top countries are not slowing down. The learning outcomes are increasing in the top performers, namely the Singapore and other East Asian high-performing countries. And on top of that, those are cognitive skills, basic cognitive skills. What we're seeing in labor market demand is a shift away from those routine manual skills and towards a higher demand for what people are calling non-routine and interactive types of skills. We're also seeing this in the United States. It's been happening since the 1990s. We see it in other parts of North America and Europe, and we're now seeing it in developing countries as well. So to make the challenge for many countries even more difficult, there's still an access challenge, still a cognitive achievement challenge, and now new skills are appearing in the market that make it even more difficult to keep up. Automation is often cited, and as well as technological change, as a positive force for improving efficiency, for reducing costs, for allowing people to move away from boring, repetitive work and to give us more leisure time and freedom. At the same time, people do fear many aspects of automation, the loss of jobs. There was an influential study a couple of years ago arguing that almost half the jobs in the United States are at risk to automation. Not necessarily that half the people become unemployed, but that those jobs would be affected somehow by technology. And this real fear of artificial intelligence and what it might mean for mankind is very much in the back of people's minds. From my analysis of what's happening in the last several decades, we've seen this tremendous growth in higher education, more than tripling worldwide of enrollments in higher education. So the supply of graduates has increased threefold. What's happened to the price? It's pretty much the same. This is not something that Economics 101 would teach us. We would expect with such an increase in supply to see something happen to the price. Yet the graduates are still earning very high salaries. In fact, in many parts of the world, that gap is actually increased. So the skills premium has increased. And it's increased, I think, for two reasons. One is there is an actual increase in demand for higher order skills. And there is poor quality education in many parts of the world. It's not keeping up. So those people that happen to have those skills and that higher level of schooling are able to command a very high wage, and employers are willing to pay for it. And what this means is that education has gone from being the 20th century great equalizer to a contributor to growing inequality. Because as those salaries of the higher educated go up, as the skills gap increases, there will be growing inequality as a result of this. So education actually contributes to inequality for the first time in our history. So this race between education and technology, a phrase I've borrowed from Jan Tinbergen, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who argued back in 1974 that education needs to constantly reform and move to keep pace with changing technology, and that for most of the 20th century, it did this, and that growing education achievement led to greater equity around the world as wage rates equalized between higher and lower educated. So that was the contribution in the 20th century. In the 21st century, we're seeing much different picture affecting education systems, which are no longer able to keep up with the changing technology. So one question is who's at most risk of automation in terms of who's more likely to either lose their job or be affected in a way that will make them worse off as a result. So in our analysis, we found three things that will make you safe or automation-proof. One is higher levels of schooling, and it's much higher level of schooling. It's not enough to go to high school. Tertiary education seems to be the best bet against being in occupations or in a task that's most likely to be affected by automation. Second, learning outcomes. Those basic cognitive skills, the foundations of education systems. The higher your score on these types of assessments is significantly correlated with being in jobs that are less likely to be affected by automation and artificial intelligence. Also, vocational education. One would think that vocational education should have a direct link to labor markets. After all, its title says teaching people skills that are needed in labor markets. In fact, it's probably the worst thing you can do to go to formal vocational systems because they're preparing you for jobs of today. And we're seeing a high correlation between vocational education and being in precisely those kinds of tasks, jobs that are most likely to be automated. So tremendous challenges for most education systems, especially in developing countries. There's still a need to increase educational attainment. This becomes more and more expensive as you reach universal levels of education at any level, and especially as you go to higher levels. The cost of increasing cognitive skills becomes more expensive, and we have much less evidence about how to teach non-cognitive skills. We know they're important, but how do we integrate them and bring them into the curriculum is a tremendous challenge. So what can we do? Focus on the early years, early reading especially. This is showing tremendous promise for higher levels of achievement and creating the workforce of the future, and focusing on the basics. This was true in 1960, it's true today. The most successful education systems have built from the bottom up. Learn from the best. Which countries are achieving the best in cognitive areas? It's mostly East Asian countries. These are the top 10 performers from our harmonized learning outcomes database. And even among the top 10, there's a big difference between the West European and the East Asian countries. 50 points, 60 points in some areas. This is about 2 years of schooling difference, even among the top performers. And we can learn a lot from the East Asian superpowers. The other aspect is to invest in these relevant skills. So for many years, decades, people have been talking about socio-emotional skills, non-cognitive. Here's some of these skills. They've been called different things, but now what we have is evidence that employers are willing to hire people with these kinds of skills and pay them more. So we're seeing gaps in pay not only for higher levels of schooling, but also for people that have these kinds of skills, social skills, the ability to work in teams, to collaborate, to problem solve. There's solid evidence now that these skills are in demand and people will pay for them. The difficult part, the challenge is to integrate the teaching of these skills into the core curriculum. Building an education system akin to, we talk about Industry 4.0, what about Education 4.0? I would argue that Education 4.0 might be a system of lifelong learning where people are able to self-actualize, to get the attention they need anytime they need it. Are we there yet? I don't think so. We have some elements maybe in some systems, but I think for most students the reality is the 20th century or 19th century schoolhouse with the teacher and the lecture type of education. We haven't yet taken those lessons and brought them to the mass school system. University is becoming very popular. There's tremendous social demand, but governments are unable to continue to expand through public budgets to give quality education for all. So we need innovation in the financing of higher education. Otherwise, we'll have many people going to university who aren't prepared or not getting the quality they want. Some of the innovations require innovative financing that would allow us to tap future earnings in order to pay for the education of today. England, Australia, New Zealand does this very well. So if I could sum up, I would say basic skills are still in demand in most parts of the world, and we're unfortunately failing many students. Schooling needs to improve also in terms of the efficiency, teaching people more of the basics faster in order to catch up because the top performers are not slowing down. We need to integrate the teaching of relevant skills into the curriculum. We have to avoid early specialization. After all, we don't know what the jobs of the future will be, but we certainly know that some of the skills that will be important, and innovations in higher education. So there's a huge research agenda, I would say, and it includes finding out how we can make education more productive, how we can teach relevant skills, financing higher education, and big challenge, and for some of you, you may have ideas, is how do we bring technology into the education system so that we're able to improve its effectiveness, its efficiency, and give people what they want sooner. Thank you.